welcome back to this next video in which we are discussing schizophrenia. Okay, so in the previous video we had a look at what schizophrenia actually is, and we saw this nice three-word description of it as a disorder of volition. And what we've seen is that that means that mental processing power is not going to be devoted to thoughts in the correct way. So certain thoughts that should receive very little processing power are going to get far too much processing power, and thoughts that should have a large amount of processing power are going to get far too little, and that gives rise to these two categories of symptoms in schizophrenia. The positive or psychotic symptoms come from the thoughts that shouldn't have that much processing power getting far too much processing power, and the negative symptoms, which comes from thoughts that should have a lot of processing power not getting enough processing power. Okay, what I do want to stress, which I don't think I fully developed in the previous video, is that this is involuntary. In people with schizophrenia, they cannot control this. It's not the case that they are sitting there saying, right, and now I'm going to devote far too much mental processing power to this stupid thought. No, it's a involuntary thing that the brain is doing wrongly. So fundamentally, this is a disorder of the brain. The brain is attributing processing power incorrectly to the different thoughts. The other thing that I'd like to make a brief comment on is the cause of schizophrenia. What is the cause of this? What causes this disorder of volition? The answer to that is still very, very controversial. One of the biggest risk factors, however, that everyone can agree on for developing schizophrenia is the use of recreational drugs, particularly cannabis and other synthetic cannabinoids. There is a huge association between the use of cannabis and the development of schizophrenia. And it's one of the reasons that I always get upset when I see on social media these posts, people making these posts about how we should legalize marijuana in this country and in other countries around the world. And they always have the same sort of theme. It always starts off by slating alcohol and tobacco, which are legal in this country and legal in a lot of countries, and then it will show how much better cannabis is. So it will say something like alcohol causes big statistic number of road traffic accidents each year, and then it will have tobacco causes this many cases of lung cancer each year, and then it will have something like cannabis causes absolutely nothing, it just makes you relaxed, and therefore we should legalize cannabis. And I always sort of hang my head in my hands and shout, no! Cannabis causes schizophrenia, almost certainly. It certainly increases your risk of developing schizophrenia, so we should not legalise cannabis. And indeed, that's one of the great messages that I hope to convey in this video. Do not use recreational drugs. It hugely increases your risk of schizophrenia. Indeed, alcohol and tobacco are now being associated with schizophrenia as well, but they don't increase your risk as much as cannabis and other recreational drugs do. Okay, there are other risk factors for developing schizophrenia apart from drug use, but drug use is the big one that you should certainly know about. Okay, right, so let's return now to discussing the different symptoms of schizophrenia, and before we just do that, let me make sure everyone understands that I'm going to go through a huge great list of symptoms here. I've got another great big category of positive symptoms to go over, and then I've got loads of negative symptoms to go through. People with schizophrenia, they won't have every single one of the symptoms that I'm about to list off. For instance, if they have hallucinations, they're not going to have auditory, visual, and somatosensory hallucinations necessarily. I am listing off all of the symptoms that you can have in schizophrenia. An individual person with schizophrenia will not have every single one of these symptoms. They'll have their own unique combination of these symptoms. And we'll talk later about the 4 different types of schizophrenia and the different combinations of symptoms from these lists that characterize each of those different types. So just to be aware at the moment that an individual person with schizophrenia will not have every single one of the symptoms that I am listing here. Okay, so for instance, you won't necessarily have all of these different types of hallucinations. In fact, I've never met anyone with schizophrenia who's had every single one of these types of hallucinations. And certain cases of schizophrenia won't have any hallucinations at all. So people often think of this as the characteristic symptom of schizophrenia, auditory hallucinations. However, it's not part of the definition of schizophrenia. There are cases of schizophrenia, in particular simple schizophrenia, that doesn't have auditory hallucinations and doesn't actually have any of the psychotic symptoms. But we'll talk more about that later on. Okay, so the other category then of positive symptoms of schizophrenia is delusions. So I'll start by writing this down and then we'll define what is meant by a delusion. Okay, so hallucinations and delusions, these are the two big categories of positive symptoms of schizophrenia. So, we will start then by defining what a delusion is. So, a delusion is a belief that cannot be true. It's when you believe in something that cannot possibly be true, and it's obvious that it's not true. And the other key thing that I should add on there is that this belief cannot be explained by a cultural or religious background. So belief in God, no matter what you believe, is not counted as a delusion, because despite some people arguing that there's very little evidence for it, it can be explained by your cultural and religious background and therefore wouldn't be counted as a delusion. So these are silly beliefs that the person absolutely believes, and you cannot change that. If you talk and talk and talk and suggest alternative reasons to explain things, they cannot be shaken. Okay, so it's an unshakable belief that is evidently false and which cannot be explained by their cultural or religious background. So that's the definition of a delusion. We characterize delusions into different categories, and there are lots of these different categories. I'm going to go over three major types of delusion, or categories of delusion, that people can experience in schizophrenia. And again, I will remind you that an individual person with schizophrenia will not most likely have all of these different types of delusion. Okay, so different categories of delusion then. So the absolutely infamous one that I'll start off with is delusions of persecution. So all of these different categories of delusion, they have great big grandiose titles. So it's delusions of persecution, delusions of grandeur, and delusions of perception. But we'll start off with delusions of persecution here. So persecution means victimization, basically. It means that you think you're being attacked. So people with delusions of persecution will have these beliefs that they are in mortal danger, that doom is coming, that people are attacking them, people are plotting their attack, and people have it in for them, basically. And the classic scenario is that they believe that the security services and the police are plotting against them and are victimizing them. So if you're in the UK, there'll be MI5 and MI6 that are plotting against me. If you're in America, there'll be the FBI and the CIA, etc. So delusions of persecution, you believe that someone is trying to attack you. Okay, and before we go any further with this discussion of delusion, let's just discuss the theory of where these delusional beliefs actually come from. So it's still controversial as to how delusions actually fit into our understanding of what schizophrenia is. Some people believe that it's, again, thoughts that shouldn't be being potentiated, which are being potentiated, that gives rise to the delusions. Other people believe that the delusions are created by the brain to explain the hallucinations. Okay, so if you're having auditory hallucinations where you can hear police officers talking about you as though they're monitoring you, maybe you're getting a commentary of your life, then you may well end up believing that you are being spied upon by the security services and the police. You have to try and put yourself in this position. Imagine that you are hearing people talking about you and commenting on your life, then you may well end up believing that the police have implanted something in your brain and are monitoring you, and that this thing inside your brain is misfunctioning, which is why you're actually hearing it. In addition, people can end up believing that they are living within the Truman Show. So the Truman Show is a famous film made quite a few years ago now, about a man called Truman who was living inside a massive great dome, an artificial reality basically, and every moment of his life was being filmed. He was completely unaware that he was in this massive dome. He was a reality TV show star who had been in there since birth, and the dome was so large that it was, a whole world inside there, and he was on this little island and had never gone off the island and was just being filmed his entire life. And the film, The Truman Show, follows his discovery that he's inside this dome and him trying to escape from the dome. So people can end up believing that they're inside the Truman Show, that they are being watched and that they're the star of a reality TV show, and that they've just figured out that indeed they are inside that. And I think that would also probably come under the category of delusions of persecution. And those types of delusion are actually called Truman Show delusions. So I'll just write those down. And what's interesting about delusional beliefs is they are in tune with current society. So before the Truman Show had actually been created, no one had Truman Show delusions, or no one had recorded anyone having Truman Show delusions. Only once the Truman Show film had actually been created and loads of people had seen it, did we then start seeing people with Truman Show delusions. So what that tells us is that these delusions, they're created by the brain from what the brain already knows, and it's seen this film and it understands that that could actually happen, and now it's using that to explain these voices that it's hearing, and etc. So delusional beliefs are in tune with current society. Okay, so Truman Show delusions is a type of delusion of persecution. People sometimes also call delusions of persecution delusions of paranoia, but I prefer delusions of persecution. Okay, right, so that's one category of delusional belief. Second category of delusional belief is delusions of grandeur, and I'll omit rewriting out delusions. So delusions of grandeur. So delusions of grandeur is where you believe that your status in the world is much higher than it ever possibly could be. So people might believe that they are a god, that they're a prophet, that they're a deity of some other form, that they're Jesus, etc. Okay, so that's delusions of grandeur, and I suppose you could also think of Truman Show delusions as kind of being classified as delusions of grandeur because you believe that you're the centre of this TV show. It would depend on your exact response to the Truman Show delusions, whether you were behaving very paranoid because of them, or whether you were behaving more like a film star. Then we might count it as a delusion of grandeur. Okay, so delusions of grandeur is the second major category of delusions, and then the final one that I want to talk about, and I should stress there are loads of other categories of delusion, huge number of different categories of delusion, but these are the major three, is delusions of perception. And delusions of perception is where you see or hear or feel or taste or smell something, so you perceive some sensory stimulus. And that sensory stimulus is there, it's not a hallucination. However, you come to some bizarre conclusion from that sensory stimulus. So you might, see a plane flying above and then suddenly conclude that the security services are out to get you. So you might see a sensory stimulus or perceive a sensory stimulus and then make a completely insane conclusion from that. And those sorts of delusions are called delusions of perception. So as I said earlier, there are two different explanations that people use to explain delusional beliefs in schizophrenia. Some people believe that delusional beliefs are a direct result of aberrant salience, i.e. that they too result because thoughts that shouldn't be being grown, shouldn't be having salience attached to them, are having salience attached to them. Other people believe that the delusional beliefs are a secondary result of the hallucinations, i.e. they're a way for the person to explain the hallucinations to themselves. So just going over how that would work, because the second of these two explanations is the preferred one for most people. Most people believe the second of the two. So for delusions of persecution, if, for instance, you were having hallucinations of police officers giving a commentary of your life, a third-person commentary of your life, then you can imagine that you might end up believing that you are being spied upon by the police and the secret services. For delusions of grandeur, if you have a voice telling you that you are a prophet that has come to the earth to do some great mission, then you may well end up believing that that is true. For delusions of perception, if you have a voice saying, that aeroplane that has just gone over, that means that the secret services are spying on you, then you may end up actually believing that. So most people do believe that the delusional beliefs come about because the person tries to explain the hallucinations to themselves. So the delusional belief is a way to make sense of the hallucinations. It's the general way that people interpret delusional beliefs in schizophrenia. Okay, so these are the major two categories then of positive symptoms in schizophrenia, hallucinations and delusions. And those are resulting because thoughts that shouldn't be having salience attached to them are having salience attached to them. And we can see that that directly causes the hallucinations, and depending on what you choose to believe, it either directly causes the delusions or the delusions are secondary to the hallucinations. Okay, so now let's go on to the other category of symptoms in schizophrenia, the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. Now, as I said earlier, the negative symptoms of schizophrenia, they come about because thoughts that should have salience attached to them are not having salience attached to them and are not getting enough processing power. Okay, so let's go through the different types of negative symptoms of schizophrenia then. So we'll start by talking about the effects on cognition of schizophrenia. So one of the major symptoms of schizophrenia, one of the major negative symptoms of schizophrenia is cognitive deficits. So I'll just put cognition goes down. Okay, so let's just talk about what this word cognition actually means, because it's a word that I'm sure you have heard before, but do you actually know what the definition of cognition actually is? So, a simple way to say what cognition is that it's a fancy word for thinking. However, what is thinking? We need a definition of that, and it is actually quite difficult. I mean, intuitively you know what it means to think. However, what is the actual definition of thinking? So, a nice definition for what cognition, for what thinking is that it's any mental process which you can put conscious attention on. So the brain is processing all sorts of information and doing all sorts of different things. The portions of the brain, the functions of the brain that can have conscious attention put onto them, those are cognitive functions of the brain. So there are loads of functions of the brain that you can't put conscious thought into. There are loads of things that no matter what you do, you cannot put conscious attention onto them. Those are not cognitive processes of the brain. The cognitive processes that are going on in the brain are the processes which you can put conscious attention on. Okay, so what sort of things therefore do come under cognition? Well, for instance, processing sensory information and understanding sensory information will come under cognition, because that is something that you can put conscious attention on. And I want to stress that cognition is not the same as consciousness. Cognition is all of the functions in the brain that can have conscious attention put on them, that you can focus on if you want. You can focus your conscious self onto them. However, often these cognitive processes will be done subconsciously, and they're still called cognitive processes. So it's not consciousness. It's all of the functions of the brain which can have consciousness focused on them if you wish. So, interpreting and processing sensory information then is certainly a cognitive process, because you will know that you can put conscious attention onto processing sensory information. However, often a lot of the sensory information will be processed subconsciously, and it's still a cognitive process. It doesn't need the conscious attention on it to be counted as a cognitive process. So processing sensory information, that's a cognitive process. Okay? Other examples of cognitive processes: remembering sensory information or remembering information at all. So memory is a cognitive process, because you will be well aware, of course, that memory can have conscious attention put on it. When you've been trying to memorize something, say a list of words, a list of new words, when you were trying to memorize them, you were putting conscious attention into remembering them. Often memory is done subconsciously. You can remember probably what you did yesterday, and you didn't consciously focus on trying to remember what you did yesterday. It happens subconsciously. But memory, therefore, is a cognitive process because it can have consciousness focused onto it. Then we can also have making decisions, and there's a fancy way of saying making decisions. It's called executive function. So executive function is a fancy way of saying making decisions. So when you decide to do something, when you decide what you're going to do today, that's an executive function process. And of course, you can consciously focus on making decisions. In fact, you often do consciously focus on making decisions, and therefore that's certainly a cognitive process. And then also actually coming up with motor plans. So I'll put this here. So all of these processes are cognitive processes. So designing motor plans. Now, what is meant by a motor plan? Well, this is a really important concept in neuroscience. When you want to make a movement, say you want to pick something up, to actually make that movement, you need a huge number of muscles to contract in exactly the right ratio at exactly the right times. Okay? To get muscles to contract in the exact way that you need them to, you need an incredible pattern of action potentials firing along loads of different neurons that are innervating those different muscles. And to create that pattern of action potentials, the brain needs to be functioning. The brain creates that pattern of action potentials. That pattern of action potentials that will go down the spinal cord and then go out the alpha motor neurons, that is what we mean by a motor plan. And the brain has to concoct that motor plan. It has to concoct that pattern of action potentials. And that is also a cognitive process, because you can consciously focus on creating a motor plan. So for instance, when you want to catch a ball, you might be consciously focusing on creating that exact motor plan that will allow you to actually catch that ball. So that's a cognitive process as well. So all of these different processes that I've now been through, these all come under cognition. So processing sensory information and interpreting it, remembering sensory information, making decisions about what you want to do, and indeed you may be using sensory information that you've just gathered to make a decision, or information from memory to make a decision, and then designing motor plans to actually initiate the movement that is part of that decision. That's also a cognitive process. So all of these processes are cognitive processes, and these sort of processes are going to be damaged in schizophrenia, because obviously these different thoughts often will need to be having salience attached to them. So for instance, when you want to process a piece of sensory information, then you want to attach more processing power to processing that piece of sensory information. So when you decide that a piece of sensory information is important and you want to process it more, that's what salience is all about. You need the ability to actually direct more processing power into that thought. In order to commit something to memory, you're also going to need to be able to attach salience to it. In order to make a decision, you're going to need to first have a small portion of the brain that comes up with that thought, that possible decision, and then to actually make that decision a reality, to actually be able to decide to do something. That thought needs to grow. It needs to have salience attached to it. It can't remain being processed by a tiny portion of the brain. So salience needs to be functioning in order for you to make decisions, and certainly to make motor plans, you need to have a functioning salience system. You need to be able to build up the correct thoughts to make that motor plan. So all of these cognitive processes can fail in schizophrenia, and indeed they often do. So you might end up with deficits in all of these, and this is why people with schizophrenia often really suffer being able to do things. They often end up sitting in their rooms all day and not going out anywhere, and that's because it's not because they're lazy, it's just because they can't actually make the decision to do something, because their salience system, which is needed in order for them to make a decision, is not functioning correctly. So a lot of the other negative symptoms that I'm going to add on now, they come from this idea that all of these cognitive processes are going to be reduced. So let me now add some more negative symptoms on, and I'm just going to move the page down a little bit so I've got more space. Okay, so more negative symptoms then, and I apologise that everything's sort of getting muddled up. I'll try and put a little line here to separate everything out. So Truman Show delusions can go over there. Right, so those are the positive symptoms over here. Now let's continue on with the negative symptoms. So, as I say, a lot of the negative symptoms are going to build on what I've said already. So one of the key negative symptoms of schizophrenia is what we call apathy, and this is a very good word to know. Apathy means that you don't really want to do anything. You haven't got any ability to do anything. You do very little. It's a description of your behaviour. It means that you're doing very, very little. Okay, and we can understand why people with schizophrenia are going to become apathetic. So apathy is the condition. The adjective to describe someone suffering with apathy is to call them apathetic. And I'm just trying to decide whether it's an E or an A now. Apathetic, I would imagine it's an E there. Okay, so I think that's how you spell it, apathetic. So this is a description of someone who is suffering with apathy, and someone who is apathetic will not be doing much. They'll be staying in the house. They won't want to go and do anything. If someone invites them out, they will say no. They'll just stay in the house, and they won't really be doing anything. They might just be sitting in a chair doing nothing, because of what we've discussed. In order to do something, you have to be able to make a decision, and in order to make a decision, salience needs to be given to that thought that is going to become that decision, and the thoughts that is going to make the motor plans. And in schizophrenia, the salience system is broken, and if it's affecting the portions of the brain that make decisions, then you're going to lose the ability to make decisions, and therefore you're going to become apathetic. Okay, so very much so linked with apathy, people with schizophrenia often become socially withdrawn, so I'll add this as a separate negative symptom. So social withdrawal. So they won't go out anymore, they won't go and see friends, they'll just remain in their house. So social withdrawal is a key negative symptom of schizophrenia, and also self-neglect is a key symptom of schizophrenia. So self-neglect. So this means no longer showering, no longer brushing your teeth, no longer doing whatever things you did to care for yourself previously. So if you're a man, shaving; if you're a woman, combing your hair and things like that. No longer being able to care for yourself. And again, we understand why this is actually occurring in schizophrenia, because in order to care for yourself, in order to go and have a shower or shave or whatever, it's a decision. You need to make that decision to be able to do that. You need to then create a motor plan in order to actually carry out that movement. And in schizophrenia, you're having problems with doing that because the salience system is broken. The ability to grow thoughts is broken. Okay, so social withdrawal and self-neglect, they clearly come under apathy. Another nice description that I'm going to put under the negative symptoms is psychomotor retardation. And again, this is just building on what we've already got, but it's another nice description that people will often use. So, psychomotor Psychomotor Retardation, and this is very, very similar to apathy. So this refers to someone's behaviour. It means that they're not really going to do or say that much. Retardation means slowing down, so their behaviour is going to be incredibly slowed down. The opposite of psychomotor retardation is psychomotor agitation, and that's where you'd be running around, jumping up in the air, speaking incredibly fast, like someone suffering with mania would show. But psychomotor retardation is the exact opposite. You're not going to be doing that much, you're not going to be saying that much. It's very similar to apathy, but it's another description that people often use for the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. Another word that's very important to know is allergy. And what this refers to is not saying that much. And again, we can understand why allergy is potentially going to be a symptom of schizophrenia, because in order to say something, you're going to need to be able to attach salience to the motor plan that will become that speech. In addition, you're going to need to be able to attach salience to the thought that will become or give rise to the motor plan for the speech. And if you can't do that, then you're going to have problems with being able to say stuff, and you will have very short speech. Okay, so allergy, we can see that that's very fitting in with all of these other negative symptoms that I've put down here. So these are all very similar. It's all because you're not able to attach salience to thoughts that really do need salience to be attached to them. Okay, so let's continue on with some more negative symptoms of schizophrenia then. The next one that I want to mention is that people suffering with schizophrenia, often they have very flattened mood. So I'll write this down. And what this means is that they don't experience the normal roller coaster ride in mood that is healthy and which most people experience. So normally, what happens is our mood fluctuates around, and I could draw a little graph for this, and I think I'll have a go at doing so. So we could draw a little graph like so, and on the x-axis here we'll have time, and on the y-axis we can have how you're feeling, your mood. And normally it would go like this. Sometimes you'll be happy, you'll have elevated mood when good things happen to you, and then other times bad things will happen, and it all fluctuate around a centre like so. So your mood goes up and down. You're not always feeling the same. Sometimes you feel happy, sometimes you feel sad. And of course, in mood disorders such as depression and bipolar disorder, this graph goes wrong. In depression, you get big peaks downwards. I'll just draw this on. So in depression, it might look something like this. You go down, go back up to normal, and then you have another depressive episode, you go down. And then in bipolar depression, it goes both ways. It goes down, and then it goes right up to above what it would be in someone who doesn't have bipolar depression. So you get manic episodes as well. Then you'd have a normal period, and then you go back down into a depressive episode. In normal people, however, mood does fluctuate around, and in schizophrenia, what ends up happening is that you get this graph flattening off. So this is very different from the mood disorders. In schizophrenia, the graph starts to look more just like this, a straight line. It's neither happy nor sad, it's just at a constant sort of flat level where you don't have the normal roller coaster ride that is normal and healthy in your mood. You just feel the same always. Basically, you have a very unreactive mood. You don't react that much to bad things happening. When emotionally bad things happen, you don't feel sad. But then along with that, of course, it's also the case that when good things happen to you, when things that should make you happy happen, you don't actually have a happy response to that. And of course, this is what we mean by flattened mood. Your mood just stays at this medium level where you don't ever fluctuate really to any big degree from that. And we can sort of understand why this is going to happen in schizophrenia, because remember, schizophrenia is all about aberrant salience. We are attaching salience in the wrong way. Now, in order to have an emotional response to something, we can understand that you're going to need to attach salience to the thought that is either happy or sad, to the emotionally significant thought, in order to grow that thought up, and so that it can then cause an emotional response that is actually noticeable to the conscious self. So we can understand that if you don't apply that salience to these emotionally significant thoughts, these thoughts about either something that's happy or something that is a bad thought, then you're not going to have much of an emotional response to it. You're not going to have a switch in your mood to it. Okay, so that is why flattened mood is a negative symptom of schizophrenia. Now, something that goes very much so with flattened mood as a negative symptom of schizophrenia is blunted affect. So I'll just move everything up, give ourselves some more space, and then I'll write this next one out. So another negative symptom of schizophrenia is blunted affect. So let's start off by discussing what's the difference between mood and affect. So mood is a subjective thing. Only the person will know what their mood is, so they have to tell you what their mood is, whether they're feeling sad, whether they're feeling happy, whether they're feeling completely indifferent to everything that's happening in their life, i.e. they have flattened mood. Affect is a more objective thing. It's something that the person talking to the individual can actually gather without having to ask the person, what's your affect like? Affect is all about non-verbal communication, so body language, particularly facial expressions. So if when you're talking to the person, are they smiling, are they gesturing with their hands, or are they just sitting there completely rigid with no expression on their face at all, as though they're wearing a mask? And in schizophrenia, what can often happen is that you get very blunted affect. So affect is all about the non-verbal communication of your mood. It's all about, are you smiling? Are you looking sad? Are you not expressing any of your emotions with your face? Is your face just completely indifferent and blank? And it's impossible to tell what your mood is. And that would go hand in hand with the flattened mood, that along with your mood being unreactive, your affect is also unreactive. So in schizophrenia, you often get blunted affect, where there is very little expression in the face, there's very little gesturing and non-verbal communication. So people often describe a mask-like face, where the face is not expressing any sort of happiness, neither is it expressing any sadness, it's just completely passive, it's not expressing anything. And again, this negative symptom of schizophrenia fits in with a lot of the other negative symptoms that we've seen already, such as psychomotor retardation and the flattened mood. In order to have a reactive effect, you need to be able to attach salience to the thoughts that are going to give rise to the facial expressions and the gesturing and things like that. Hence, if you've got schizophrenia and the salience is not functioning correctly, then you can get blunted affect. Okay, the final category of negative symptoms then that I want to go through is what is known as loosening of associations. And there are lots of different severities of loosening of associations, which I'll go through now. So the final negative symptom that I'm going to discuss is loosening of associations. And there are other symptoms of schizophrenia that you could add on to these lists, but I think I've now gone through the major ones that you should know about. So loosening of associations is the final one that I want to discuss. So what does loosening of associations mean? Loosening of associations refers to how their thoughts no longer flow in the normal way. Instead, the thoughts flow abnormally and they jump to different ideas, and eventually when you're talking to them, you'll be completely off topic from where you started. So you might start by asking them a question and they'll start by answering it, but very quickly they'll get sidetracked onto something completely different. And this is what loosening of associations is all about. It's about the loosening of how one thought is associated with another thought. So normally when you're talking to someone and they're giving you an answer, their thoughts will flow. One thought will flow onto another, and it will make sense, the pathway that their thoughts are taking. Whereas in loosening of associations, you're loosening the association between the thoughts, and you're jumping to topics that aren't quite completely relevant. And again, we can understand why that might happen if you've got aberrant salience, because in order for your thoughts to flow in the correct way, you're going to have to attach salience to the correct thoughts one after another, so that they flow together. Whereas if you're attaching salience to thoughts incorrectly, then yes, you may end up jumping around. Okay, so there are lots of different severities of loosening of associations then. And I'll go through these different severities now. Okay, so I'll write out all the names for the different severities of loosening of associations in a line here. So the least severe, I'll have over here, and it's called Tangency. And I'll go over what each of these means in just a moment. Up from Tangency, more severe than Tangency, is what's called flight of ideas. Up a stage from flight of ideas is what we call derailment. And these are all forms of loosening of associations. They're just different severities of loosening of associations. And then up from derailment is what's known as word salad. Okay, so let me go through what each of these is about then. So we'll begin with the least severe of them. We'll begin with tangentiality. So let me give an example of tangentiality. So you might ask someone, how's their day been today? And they might start answering it, and they might say, oh, I had a good morning, my mum came to see me. And then from that, they might jump then to talking about their mum, and maybe their mum's problems and things like that. And then they might jump again from that. So it's not completely irrelevant, but they jump away from the question. They go off on tangents, and that's what tangentiality is all about. Up from that is then flight of ideas. Now, flight of ideas is more severe than tangentiality. It's where the next idea along, so you start off with one idea and then you jump to another idea, but the association between the two ideas has got more severe. Now it's just associated by a single word. So the classic example of flight of ideas is, my favourite colour is blue, the sky is blue, birds live in the sky. So we've had three ideas there. The first was, my favourite colour is blue. The second idea was, the sky is blue. The third idea was, birds live in the sky. And the links between those ideas are single words. So the link between the two first ideas, the first idea of my favourite colour is blue and the second idea of the sky is blue, is just the word blue. And then the idea between the second and third idea, the sky is blue and birds live in the sky, is the word sky. So they're weaker associations between the two thoughts than we had previously. Okay, so the association between thoughts is getting worse as we go up the severities here. Derailment, there is no longer any link between the ideas. So it might just be, my favourite colour is blue, I'm going to the cinema later, that light is on over there. Jumping around from idea to idea to idea where there's no association between them at all anymore. And then finally, when you get up to word salad here, they're just uttering words that are completely unassociated anymore. So it might just be apple, light, green, cinema, clock, etc. It's just words at that point. So these are the different severities of loosening of associations. Okay, so we've now seen all of the symptoms of schizophrenia that I want to go through. And just to reiterate, we divide the symptoms of schizophrenia up into these two categories. Let me try and find what I'm trying to do. Here we go. Zoom out. We divide the symptoms of schizophrenia into these two categories, the positive symptoms and the negative symptoms. And remember, the positive symptoms of schizophrenia, they arise because of thoughts that should not be being potentiated, should not have salience attached to them, and should not grow, which are growing. And the major one there is these hallucinations, and then we believe that the delusions are secondary to the hallucinations to explain the hallucinations. However, some people believe that the delusions too are a direct result of salience being attached to thoughts that shouldn't have salience attached to them. And then the negative symptoms of schizophrenia, they result because of thoughts that should have salience attached to them not getting that salience attached to them. And we've seen that they often consist of loss of function. Okay, so for instance, cognition is reduced. The ability to do things is hugely reduced. You become apathetic, socially withdrawn, and self-neglecting. And you get these mood symptoms where your mood no longer fluctuates in the normal way. And finally, we've seen that the ability to associate thoughts correctly has gone, loosening of associations, and we've gone through the different severities of loosening of associations, Tangency Allottee all the way up to word salad. Now, I should say that word salad, it's reasonably rare that you actually see someone that's at that point where they can no longer even associate words together correctly. It's just unassociated words. But it does occur. Okay, so we'll have a break here, and in the next video what we'll do is we'll go through the 4 different types of schizophrenia. We'll look at which symptoms are associated and are characteristic of the 4 different types of schizophrenia, and then we'll go on to the treatment of schizophrenia. We'll look at both rehabilitation and the antipsychotic medications.